Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Royal Society and to this evening's Rosalind Franklin lecture. My name is Professor Frances Ashcroft, and I'm chair of the Rosalind Franklin Award Committee. And it's my very great pleasure tonight to introduce this year's award winner, which is Professor Essi Viding. And before she begins her lecture, I'm just going to say a few words about Rosalind Franklin and the award, and about Professor Viding, and then after the lecture, I will present her with the medal and the scroll. So the Rosalind Franklin Award is named in memory of Rosalind Franklin, who made a critical contribution to our understanding of the molecular structure of DNA. And as many of you may remember, she was the brilliant X-ray crystallographer who took the famous photograph that led Watson and Crick to the discovery that DNA is a double helix. The award is supported by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and it's given to someone who's made an outstanding contribution to any STEM subject, that is science, technology, engineering or mathematics. And it consists of a silver gilt award and a prize of £30,000. And the prize winner is expected to spend some proportion of that money on implementing a project to raise the profile of women in science, either at their host institution or in their area of expertise. And Professor Essi Viding was awarded the 2017 Rosalind Franklin Award for her achievements in the field of experimental psychology, her ability to communicate with the public, and her very imaginative project proposal. And she very generously intends to use almost all of the money to host a science workshop for young girls from underprivileged backgrounds. And the aim is that she will provide them with training in science communication skills so they can go back home and act as science ambassadors for their peers, enthusing and informing them. So our award winner tonight is an outstanding scientist and, as we'll soon hear, an inspirational speaker. She was born and educated in Finland, and she studied psychology in the UK, and she's now Professor of Developmental Psychopathology at the University College London, where she co-directs the Developmental Risk and Resilience Unit. Her main aim is to understand how antisocial behaviour arises and persists, and she does this by charting different developmental pathways using a variety of methods. And in this way, she's begun to characterise the biological and psychological risk factors for traits such as lack of empathy, which are thought to place children at risk of becoming psychopaths or difficult behaviour. And she's shown that children with such traits are distinct from other children showing antisocial behaviour, as we'll learn tonight. And her research has been instrumental in identifying these children and has very clear implications for therapeutic strategies, for new therapies. She's also won several prizes for her work, including the British Academy Wiley Prize in Psychology, the British Psychological Society Spearman Medal, the Royal Society Wilson Merit Award, the British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship, and the Turin Young Mind and Brain Prize. And then, of course, tonight, she also receives the Rosalind Franklin Award. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Essi Viding, and we're very much looking forward to her lecture on why some people become psychopaths. Essi.
So it's my great pleasure to give this Rosalind Franklin Award talk. It also offers you an opportunity to hear a lesser-known Nordic accent, Finnish accent, which may be at peril if the Brexit proceeds smoothly. So during this talk, I will consider what we know about development of psychopathy. And most of us are fascinated by the idea of a psychopath. If you type the term into Google, you immediately get over 20 million hits. And our fascination with psychopathy is also reflected in the number of books and films that feature psychopathic characters. And these famous fictional characters have informed our idea of what psychopaths are like. So perhaps the most famous fictional character is the serial killer Hannibal Lecter from the film Hannibal, who was incredibly clever, manipulative, but also distinctly lacked any empathy for fellow human beings. But psychopaths don't just exist in fiction. And there are also notorious real-life criminals that have featured prominently in the media, often consolidating our perception of psychopaths as dangerous serial killers, such as Ted Bundy. So Bundy assaulted and murdered numerous young women and girls during the 1970s. He confessed to 30 murders, but the real figure may be much larger, and some people estimate as large as 100. He was regarded as very handsome, clever, and charismatic, and he exploited these features in winning his victims' trust before he very cruelly and violently killed them. And his lawyer described him as the very definition of heartless evil, and he himself had a more succinct description of himself. He said, "I am the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet." But not all psychopaths are serial killers or even criminals. So what are the characteristics that define an individual with psychopathy? We have a lot of good psychometric research that has shown that characteristics such as lack of remorse and guilt, shallow affect, so really the inability to feel with your fellow human beings, superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, and manipulation of other people are characteristics that really define individuals with psychopathy. And these traits don't always occur in the context of criminal behavior, and at the moment there's a great interest in trying to understand whether there are some people with these sorts of traits functioning in mainstream society. But individuals with psychopathic traits are typically antisocial, whether that antisociality results in criminal convictions or not. So even if they manage to avoid and escape prison, they are not nice people to be around. And Bob Hare, who's one of the most prominent researchers into psychopathy, said that these individuals can be described as interspecies predators who use charm, manipulation, intimidation, and violence to control others and satisfy their own selfish needs. As a developmental psychologist, I'm interested in how psychopathic features develop. Nobody is born a psychopath, but some children are at a higher risk than others to develop psychopathy in adulthood. And my own research and research of colleagues in the field has focused on understanding what characterizes those children who are at greater risks than their peers. And you can study this question at different levels of analysis. So you can study what kinds of behaviors characterize children who are at risk of developing psychopathy. You can examine how they see and represent the world around them. So are there social and emotional processes on which these children differ from their peers? You can also look at whether their brains react differently to emotional and social information than that of their peers. And you can also use genetically sensitive study design to try and understand the relative importance of genetic and environmental influences, as well as the precise genes or environmental risk factors that might put children at greater risk of developing psychopathy. So what are the behaviors that characterize children at risk of developing psychopathy? Children who are at risk of developing psychopathy lack empathy. They don't feel remorse or guilt for what they have done. And they are good at manipulating other people, and they have a very, very strong interest in looking after number one. And in particular, it is this lack of empathy and lack of remorse that really, really sets these children apart from other children who also display antisocial behavior, but who are not at such a great risk of developing psychopathy. And these features have been termed callous unemotional traits. So when we research children who are at risk of developing psychopathy, we usually characterize their antisocial behavior, but we also measure these traits that index lack of empathy and remorse. And if you have persistent high levels of such traits, you are almost always likely to also have persistent high levels of conduct problems. And this is research that was done by my former postdoc, Nathalie Fontaine. So if you have high levels of callous and emotional traits between ages 7 and 12, you are almost invariably likely to also have persistent high levels of conduct problems. But the reverse is not true. So there are a number of children who have antisocial behavior, but who do not have these callous and emotional traits. Not only do these traits predispose to antisocial behavior, but they also make the children less pro-social. And there's some very nice work by my former PhD student, Lucy Fawkes, that has demonstrated that these children have what Lucy called inverted social reward. So they don't gain pleasure out of being pro-social and nice towards others, but they do gain pleasure from being coercive and nasty towards other people. How common are children with these sorts of traits? Now, if this circle represents all the children in the UK, about 5% at any one time have high levels of antisocial behavior, what we call conduct problems in children. And a small subset of these, about 1% of the population, also have clinically problematic levels of callous and emotional traits. You might think, well, this is not a very big number, but these children are the most severely antisocial, most problematic, most likely to persist with their antisocial behavior, and they regularly violate the rights of other people. So these are the children who are at greatest risk of developing psychopathy. The severity of the behavioral profile that we see in these children, as well as their concerning lack of empathy and remorse, and the fact that they are not really motivated by being pro-social and nice to other people, has got researchers interested in trying to understand how these children differ from their peers in the way in which they process social and emotional information. And some 20 years of research using a number of different paradigms has now shown that these children have difficulty in recognizing and reacting to other people's distress. So whether you measure this by emotion recognition paradigms, by paradigms where they are trying to pay attention to something and they are distracted by emotional stimuli, whether you look at their understanding of other people's body language or vocal expressions, you can see by using these different techniques that they really have difficulty in picking up and they are not really disturbed by other people's distress. You can also take psychophysiological measurements. Typically, if we see other people looking scared, we get a strong and robust psychophysiological reaction to that. These children do not. Interestingly, they also report feeling less fear themselves. And one of the things that we are looking into at the moment is perhaps the reason that these children have difficulty empathizing with other people is that they don't so readily feel these emotions themselves. All of us find it easier to empathize with the kinds of experiences that we are familiar with, and we have less ready access to the experiences that we are not familiar with. These children are also less responsive than their peers to sanctions. So punishment doesn't work so well for them. Also in very standard reinforcement tasks, they have difficulty in learning from punishments. So overall, there is this diminished reactivity to a number of different emotional stimuli which characterizes these children. And much of the past research has indeed focused on looking at reactivity to negative stimuli. And that helps us understand why these children might lack empathy, why they might be insensitive to sanctions. But it doesn't really explain the seemingly reduced drive to please and affiliate with others. So one of the things that we are currently interested in investigating in more detail in our research group is whether these people's responsivity to positive cues that are thought to promote affiliation is also compromised in these children. And my former PhD student, Sarah Hodgell, did a nice attentional capture with these children. And what she demonstrated is that these children are less distracted by happy facial expressions than their peers. So typically happy facial expressions are very rewarding. We find them distracting if we have to do an attentional task and we present a happy face distractor. Our attention is cramped and our reaction times go up. But we do not see this in these children with high levels of callous and emotional traits and conduct problems. A recent study led by my postdoc Liz O'Nyans and Sophie Scott's postdoc Cesar Lima also showed that these children report diminished desire to join in when they hear other people's genuine laughter. So genuine laughter is highly contagious. Most of us want to join in. These children report reduced desire to do so. Now, given the behavioral and psychological profile associated with risk for developing psychopathy, it would be extremely surprising if we did not see any neural differences, because there is no behavior without the brain. And unsurprisingly, much of the work into the neural underpinnings of developmental risk for psychopathy has focused on the areas that are known to be involved in affect processing, and also has used tasks that have probed those processes. And what these studies from our group and from also a number of other groups, like James Blair's group in America, have shown is that neural circuitry that is involved in emotion, empathic and reward processing is compromised in the children who are at elevated risk of developing psychopathy. So a number of brain areas that are involved in emotion processing, empathic processing and reward processing, so altered activity patterns in these children and also some structural differences. And I'm going to illustrate this with few examples from our own work. And I'm first going to talk about study, looking at how these children react to fearful faces which are presented very fast and then masked by a calm face. And this was work that was done in collaboration with Kat Sebastian, who was in our group at the time and is now at Royal Holloway, and also Eamon McCrory, who's co-directing the research group with me. And what we showed was that out of the children who were typically developing or had conduct problems but lower levels of callous and emotional traits, those with high callous and emotional traits had the lowest amygdala reactivity to these fearful faces that we presented to them in a very rapid way. And if you look at the data from just the children with conduct problems, you can see that the higher your callous and emotional traits, here indexed by a score on an instrument that is used to measure them, the higher your callous and emotional traits within children with conduct problems, the lower your amygdala reactivity to fear. My student, Pat Lockwood, who's now in Oxford, also looked at how these children's brains react to photographs of other people in painful situations. And we contrasted these sorts of photographs with photos with hands and feet, but which were not in painful situations. And again, we saw that among conduct children, those with highest levels of callous and emotional traits had lowest anterior insular reactivity to seeing pictures of other people in pain. And anterior insula is a brain region that is implicated in a number of studies of empathy, which is thought to be involved in subjective feelings of pain. All children with conduct problems showed at a group level lower activity than typically developing children, but it really was those with high levels of callous and emotional traits that were more, in a most pronounced way, different from the typically developing children. So what our group and others have shown is that amygdala and insular response to other people's distress is lower in children who are at risk of developing psychopathy. They also have atypical reactivity in striatum and orbitofrontal cortex to reversal learning and other reinforcement learning paradigms. Well, what about neural responses to positive emotion? So, as I've already shown you, not only do children resonate less with other people's distress, these children with callous and emotional traits, but they also don't seem to experience positive emotions in the same way. And laughter is a universal expression of positive emotion, and it's something that promotes affiliation, which is very nicely demonstrated here in a photograph of my daughter taken some years back, having an affiliative interaction with Professor Louise Olsenord, who's very funny. You can seek her out afterwards. And we collaborated together with Professor Sophie Scott's group at UCL. Sophie is an expert in studying positive emotions and laughter and the neural circuitry associated with them. And we thought that it would be interesting to use the stimuli, that she's developed to study the children with high levels of conduct problems and callous unemotional traits. And Sophie has shown in her research that displaying laughter sounds promotes activity in supplementary motor area and in anterior insula, and these are thought to help people with motor preparation for joining in with others, and are also thought to reflect the positive effect that arises from listening to genuine laughter. So we got a number of boys inside brain scan and made them listen to sounds of laughter, which they found slightly odd, but they were good sport and did the study. And this study was led by Liz O'Nions and also by Cesar Lima, who was in Sophie Scott's group. And what we found was that compared to typically developing youth, those with conduct problems and high callous and emotional traits showed diminished activity in the supplementary motor area and also in the anterior insula. We also had a group of children who had conduct problems and lower levels of callous and emotional traits. They also didn't look entirely typical, but nor were they as different from the controls as were the high callous group. The group with high callous and emotional traits, as I've already told you, reported that they felt less inclined to join in with the laughter, and this was partly explained by the anterior insular activity. So that seemed to be something that was there to promote the joining in. Now, this is only one study, it's baby steps. We think that the reduced anterior insular and supplementary motor engagement could reflect both decreased positive effect in response to laughter and also decreased preparation to join in and laugh along, but we would need further experiments to really interrogate what precise process is going on there. And what we don't know with our cross-sectional data is whether this sort of pattern is a cause or a consequence of the affiliative, atypical affiliation, and I think it's probably a bit of both. So if you don't ordinarily react in the same way to the kind of stimuli that promotes affiliation, then your social interactions are going to end up being canalized in a very different way than they do for children who may more keenly react to that sort of stimuli. So what do these neurocognitive studies tell us about challenges for typical socialization practices? And I think they paint a picture of a child that will be a challenge for our typical socialization methods. So typically we tell children when they've done something nasty, we say, oh look, you've just hit little Pete. Pete is looking extremely upset. How would you feel if this happened to you? This is empathy induction, and this is what every parent and carer and auntie and uncle of a child does when they see a child behaving in a way that distresses somebody else. We also give children sanctions when they do something bad. So again, you take away privileges, you put somebody in a naughty step. It's not nice, the children try to avoid it. We also capitalize on the fact that most children want to please us. So the fact that they want to make us happy, we can put into good use when we try and motivate their behavior. Now you can probably see that if you don't find other people's distress particularly upsetting, if you're not very good at making connection between your behavior and the consequences that follow, and if you don't really mind about making other people happy, or if their happiness isn't very rewarding for you, then your typical tools of socialization are not going to be very effective. Where does this kind of risk for developing psychopathy stem from? What are the relative importance of genetic and environmental influences in bringing about this sort of behavior? And what are the risk genes and what are the risk environments? And one of the ways in which you can try and answer this question is by conducting twin studies. And I've been very fortunate for many years now to collaborate with Professor Robert Plomin from King's, who runs a big developmental twin register, the twins early development study, and we've been able to use data from this study to look at these questions. And the first study we published showed that conduct problems in the children with high callous and emotional traits are strongly heritable. Most of the group difference in the level of conduct problems between these children and the rest of the population is due to genetic risk factors, and the remainder appears to be due to child siblings different from each other. Now, that doesn't mean that these children are genetically destined to become antisocial, but it does indicate that they are more genetically vulnerable to developing those sorts of behaviors. The twin studies do not tell us anything about the individual risk genes or the individual risk environments. They don't identify what the risk genes or environments are, they just tell us about the relative importance of them. So do we know anything about the actual genes or the actual environments? And the answer is not very much at the moment. So ourselves and others have speculated that we may be looking at genes that index lower arousal to distressing affect or lower propensity to affiliate. And there are some candidate gene studies, for instance, on the oxytocin receptor genes. This is a hormone that is thought to promote affiliation that are implicated in the development of psychopathic traits. But those studies have been conducted in very small samples, and they haven't always replicated. In collaboration with Robert's group, we've also done genome-wide association studies, and those genome-wide association studies have not implicated the genes that have been shown to have an association in candidate gene studies. So more than likely, what we're looking at is lots of genes of small effect size cumulatively adding to the risk, possibly in some cases rare variants which would not be picked up in the kinds of studies that we have seen to date, and likely also gene environment interplay. So some of that heritability estimate that we see is likely to reflect gene environment interplay. What about environments? It's very, very tempting whenever you see somebody behaving badly to conclude that their parents must have been really awful to them. And it's not so straightforward. In fact, there is some research that suggests that you do not see a typical dose-response relationship between harsh and negative parenting and antisocial behavior in those children who have high levels of callous unemotional traits. We also have shown that it may be that these sorts of parenting features are and their association with behavior could be an epiphenomenon of genetic risk in the families. So if you think about it, parents who are at genetic risk of displaying antisocial behavior are much more likely to have children who are at genetic risk of displaying antisocial behavior, and they are also likely to have traits that are not optimal in terms of parenting. And therefore, when you demonstrate an association between a certain parenting practice and a child outcome, that may just reflect a family-level genetic risk rather than a causal environmental pathway from the parenting practice to the child behavior. We also know that children who are very antisocial are very, very difficult to parent, so they evoke different reactions in their parents. So again, another way in which there may be a genetic confound in that association. But there is also some very nice genetically informative data that does show that environment definitely can make a difference. Luke Hyde, who's a colleague who works in America, demonstrated using an adoption study design that if you had children who were at genetic risk, but they were fortunate enough to be placed in adoptive environments where the adoptive parents were very good at being consistent and very good at being warm, they had a reduced risk of developing antisocial behavior and callous unemotional traits. They also showed that those children at genetic risk as a group were at a higher risk of developing antisocial behavior despite being adopted away. So it suggests that there is a genetic risk, but that genetic risk can be moderated by environmental circumstances that are favorable. And this brings me to need to understand gene-environment interplay, in particular gene-environment correlation. So we tend to try and separate genes and environment, but that is often a very, very artificial thing to do. And we have talked about and known about gene-environment correlation for decades now, yet we have very little good research into this phenomenon. And I think that establishing such research will be critical if we want to better help children who are at risk of developing psychopathy. So both children and their caregivers show substantial heritable individual differences in their social information processing, in their reasoning ability, in their ability to regulate their affect. And this impacts upon how the children behave and what they respond to, and how the caregivers behave and how they react to the child. And I'm going to illustrate this by giving a sort of a pictorial example of phenomenon of evocative gene-environment correlation. And evocative gene-environment correlation really just means that different children who have different behavioral repertoires can evoke remarkably different reactions in the same adult. So I have a parenting philosophy and preferred parenting tactics, and I have also 2 children. So here is my daughter, who is very, very pliable, wants to please you, is always happy. And if I had stopped after having her, I would be very willing to dole out parenting advice. And here is my son after being refused screen time. So myself as a parent and my parenting ideals haven't changed, but how I have parented these 2 children has ended up being quite different because they respond to very different things. So shared genetic and neurocognitive vulnerabilities may restrict, in fact likely restrict, the range of possible social inputs over the child's development, and they may undermine the caregiver's capacity to respond to the needs of the child. And I would argue that we need a better mapping of information and affective processing biases across development, and that this can help us understand some of the nuts and bolts of gene-environment correlation. So to summarize, what characterizes children at risk of developing psychopathy? Well, we know there is genetic vulnerability. We know that environmental conditions are also important, perhaps those that don't counteract the genetic risk or even those that make it worse, and we still know very little about what precisely they are. These children also lack emotional reactivity, empathy, they're insensitive to punishment, they show atypical affiliation, and we can index this in a number of different levels of analysis. Now, at this point, if I may, I'm going to anticipate a few questions. I'm going to preempt, hopefully, a few questions that I typically get. So are these children just like any other children with antisocial behavior, but just with slightly more severe behavior? Why don't we just talk about children with conduct problems? Why do we need to worry about the label psychopath? Well, they are not just like every other child with antisocial behavior. So if we look at children who have antisocial behavior in a clinical range, but who don't have the high callous and emotional traits, at behavioral level, these children's aggression is characterized with clear environmental triggers. They're either frustrated or they're scared and they lash out. They are not committing the kind of premeditated, planned aggressive acts in order to look after number one, which we see in children who are at risk of developing psychopathy. Oh gosh. They also have typical or exaggerated behavioral and neural responses to emotional stimuli. So their pattern of responding to emotions is very different from that which we see in children at risk of developing psychopathy. And also, we have shown in twin studies that environmental influences are more important in explaining antisocial behavior in this group. So the origins, the etiology of antisocial behavior is different. Are these children similar to children on the autism spectrum is another question that I used to regularly get. So people say, surely both groups lack empathy. Do you just have another way of indexing autism here? And in fact, Francesca Haffey, who I did my PhD with and have collaborated with since, and I got so irritated with this question that we conducted a number of studies to really look at what's going on. And our former PhD students, Liz O'Nyans and Alice Jones, have been leading these studies. So no, these are not children on the autism spectrum. One of the characteristics of children on the autism spectrum is that they are very poor manipulators. They are not good at understanding and knowing what other people think. They lack that ability entirely, and this is not something that is characteristic of individuals who are at risk of developing psychopathy. Children on the autism spectrum have difficulty mentalizing, they have difficulty knowing what someone else is thinking, but they do resonate with other people's distress. Other people's distress makes them feel uncomfortable. They may not act or behave in an empathic way because they have difficulty in understanding what are the social norms, but they do not like seeing and hearing other people in distress. Children on the autism spectrum have atypical neural response to other people's mental states, and this is not seen in children at risk for psychopathy. And the genetic and environmental risk factors are largely independent, between autistic traits and the callous unemotional traits. So to summarize, children at risk of developing psychopathy are not merely children with severe antisocial behavior. They represent a distinct developmental route to persistent antisocial behavior, and they have a very different neurocognitive profile to that which we see in children who are antisocial but who have low levels of psychopathic traits. Children at risk of developing psychopathy are also not like children who are on the autism spectrum. There's a different etiology for these two conditions, and the two conditions are characterized by different socio-emotional deficits. So the best way I can describe it is that the children on the autism spectrum feel it, but they don't know what to do about it, and children who have callous and emotional features don't feel it, but they do know how to manipulate you. So can research such as ours make a difference? Obviously, I'd like to think so, otherwise I would probably find a different job. But I would argue that to date, what we have clearly shown, and our colleagues have shown, is that not all children with conduct problems are the same. So we're still stuck with behavioral diagnoses, but people arrive at this diagnosis via a number of different routes, and research clearly points to need for individualized interventions. One jacket will not fit all if we want to help these children. Our own longitudinal work shows that psychopathic features are not inevitably fixed. So we need to understand how we can get better at preventing persistent antisocial behavior. So we need to get better at identifying what are those things that can be used to reduce risk of developing psychopathy. Many people ask, can we train empathy? I have limited hope. I think people have a certain natural range within which they work. You won't make a very anxious person incredibly chilled, and you're probably not going to make somebody who's not naturally aroused by someone else's distress the most cuddly person on the planet. However, you can probably work around. You can perhaps promote pro-social behavior by different means, by alternative socialization strategies. So we need to get better at understanding what those might be. And I have huge hope in the research into positive emotions, because I can think of ways in which those could be conditioned and altered possibly and used alongside lots of other methods that we know work with children to help better socialization. I also think that an improved understanding of the familial vulnerabilities will help promote more successful comprehensive interventions for these children. And if these were easy questions, we would have cracked them a long time ago. So in order to answer these sorts of questions, we need to attract the best brains to science. And this brings me to the Rosalind Franklin project that I'm hoping to conduct. In a letter to her father in 1940, Rosalind Franklin wrote, "Obviously my method of thought and reasoning is influenced by a scientific training." And I think that we need to be able to offer scientific training to a diverse set of individuals to maximize the speed with which we are able to make scientific advances. And my Rosalind Franklin project is to work with 20 GCSE-aged girls from a set of backgrounds that are typically underrepresented in science careers. And these girls, as Dame Ashcroft already said, are to participate in a workshop at UCL that will give them exposure to science, but will also train them in a host of transferable skills that often act as gatekeepers for when people want to go to university and scientific training, such as presenting or interview skills. And I hope that these girls can go back to their schools and take what they have learned through the school setting, but they will also help us create a web resource that will be accessible more widely to all the schools across UK. And at this point, it remains for me to thank the Royal Society for the Rosalind Franklin Award, which is a great honour and gives me an opportunity to conduct this exciting project. And I also want to thank, first and foremost, all the people who participate in our research, without whom we couldn't do anything. Various people who have over the years and still work in our unit, and particularly I want to highlight Professor Eamon McCrory, who co-directs the unit with me and who I call my scientific husband, and I hope his real husband doesn't mind. I also want to list the number of collaborators, mentors, and what I've called champions, so people who have spurred me on in one way or another. during my career, as well as funding agencies. You need money to do research. So we're very grateful for all the funds we've received. I want to acknowledge family and friends, many of whom are in the audience and who contribute more to the successful science that they perhaps realize, because every now and again you need a break. And I want to finally leave you with evidence that when he gets over his disappointment of not being allowed screen time, my son is delightfully enthusiastic about building Lego and other activities, and that evokes very positive feelings in his mother. So I'm going to finish on this note, and I'm very happy to take questions.
So we now have time for questions, which you've very generously said you'll take. And what I'd ask people to do is to use the microphone, please. So if you stick your hand up, someone will come, bring you a microphone, and if you say your name, that would also be very nice. Thank you. And so there's one over there.
Thank you for a great talk. I wondered what percentage of the population is considered psychopathic in the UK?
So I think that the estimate is that just under or around 1%, that's what the estimate is. But unfortunately, there is actually not very good epidemiological data, so these numbers with both adults and children, we extrapolate from knowing what percentage has antisocial behavior disorder, and then what percentage of those we know to have very high features of psychopathic traits.
At the back, in blue. Meanwhile, while you take the microphone there, I will ask a question. So what you showed was you showed in the brain imaging studies that these people, the ones with psychopathic tendencies, had reduced activity. So I'd like to know, are they just depressed? I mean, activity depressed? What makes them, what makes them excited? You know, what turns on their neuronal activity?
So they get excited about instrumental rewards, so rewards that they prize. So that may be monetary rewards, that may be social dominance. Those are the things that excite them. And you do see patterns that correspond with that in different parts of the brain.
And that's greater than in other people?
In some cases, yes.
Right. Okay, if you'd like to ask your question.
Okay. Is it just children that show all these traits, or can it also be that they don't show any traits, but then something happens to them, like an emotional trauma or something, and then they develop psychosis or like
psychopathic traits? It's a really good question, and one of the things that Eamon and I are really interested in looking at is whether you have a different developmental route to this sort of callous presentation, which is what I would call a phenocopy. So these would not be what I'd call a primary psychopath or at risk of developing primary psychopathy, which is due to genetic risk. These would be individuals who have perhaps experienced some kind of a very, very powerful childhood trauma, and who, as a result, present in a way that looks callous and unempathic, but the origins of that sort of behavior in those individuals would be very different. And we've got some preliminary data that suggests that you can see this sort of pattern in some maltreated individuals, but what you see is that it's not accompanied by this blunted amygdala reactivity which you've seen in the primary psychopaths. And in fact, these individuals often have comorbid anxiety, which, you know, your typical psychopath is not anxious. So in a sense, it just serves to show that when we look at the level of behavior, that's not enough. You can sometimes present in a certain way that looks similar, but the origin of the behavior is very different.
Here at the front in blue. And can you take to the gentleman at the back, please?
In your research, you said you looked at boys. Was it just boys you looked at, and why didn't you look at females?
Because these children are fiendishly difficult to recruit. It's less common in girls, and because we know less about these sorts of traits and behaviors in girls, we can't be confident that if we recruit a mixed group, the group has a similar etiology. So in order to do the science as cleanly as possible, since we're in early stages, we focused on boys for whom these sorts of traits are much more common. But you do see these traits in girls, and sometimes they can express in a different way. So for instance, girls with these sorts of traits are much more likely to engage in relational aggression, so bullying by spreading rumors, for instance, or tarnishing someone's reputation, than they are to engage in physical aggression. So definitely you can see these traits in girls, but because the research is still in a relatively early stage, it has focused on the group in which these traits are more common, or the bad behaviors associated with the traits are more common.
Yes. And can someone bring the microphone over here?
I'm thinking about the adult serial killers. I know they are the sort of high-profile stuff. But if they're so intelligent or capable and manipulative, why do they get caught?
Well, I don't think that they're necessarily hyper-intelligent. They may just have, I mean, Ted Bundy was very intelligent, but I guess if you do it long enough, the people who are hunting you are also clever, and then you will get caught.
We also had another question down here. Here with the stripy jumper. Behind you, Annabelle.
Is absent fathers an effect?
Sorry?
Absent fathers.
Absent fathers. I don't know that anyone has looked at that. It's likely that many children who display these sorts of behaviors do have absent fathers, but how causal that is hard to know, because most people who have absent fathers who don't turn out like that. So again, it may be one of those things that is another example of gene-environment correlation, where if you have certain traits, you're less likely to be able to stay together with somebody, but whether that separation has a causal effect on those sorts of traits, it may do, but I would possibly be slightly skeptical as to whether it has. Yeah.
At the very back.
Your talk was predicated on the fact that psychopathy and psychopaths are bad, but would you agree that there is quite a large component of the 1% of people who have psychopathic characteristics that don't exhibit antisocial characteristics? They may have low guilt, low empathy, low fear, but don't exhibit antisocial behaviour. And that actually in the future, these people who interact with other people and the world in such a neurodivergent and different way might actually have huge things to offer society and the world, especially given the many crises we currently face.
That's another interesting question. I would argue that if you have very high levels of these traits, it's extremely unlikely, and in fact there's data showing that it's extremely unlikely that you're not antisocial. That doesn't mean that you're antisocial in a way that will get you criminally convicted, but you're probably going to behave in ways that are not going to be pleasant to people around them. It may be that some of these features will be features that can be very desirable in certain situations. And in fact, I would argue that there's probably particular professions in which you have a higher concentration of individuals with some of these traits and who function in quite a, at least societally acceptable way, even if they are not the kindest people. However, you know, the traits occur on the continuum. So it may be that if you have sort of middling high levels, you can adaptively function in particular professions. If you have very, very high levels, I would be extremely surprised if at one point or another you would not end up doing something that is deeply, deeply unpleasant, even if it's not criminal. And you were talking about these people doing something that is helpful to other people. Now, if you have really high levels of these traits, you are only interested in looking after number one. So you will probably be helpful to other people as long as it's good for you. But the minute a situation comes about that it's not so great for you anymore, you probably wouldn't. So if you have really high levels of these traits, at some point I think you will end up doing something that will be deeply antisocial to others, even if it's not antisocial in a way that will get you a criminal conviction.
I can't help but ask Donald Trump.
I was waiting for it. I had a bet with my husband. So they both. Since I know that there are discussions about abolishing the cold water rule, but since it hasn't been conclusively done yet, I would not offer diagnosis from the distance. I will say what I said in a recent interview, which is that he can be comfortably diagnosed as giant toddler, although that may be possibly too unkind to toddlers.
I'm glad you asked that question. I was fascinated too. At the back over here.
Do you think that maybe the opinion you have on the characteristics and behaviorisms of adult psychopaths might be skewed to by the fact that psychopaths who are more in control of themselves and don't harm other people fly under the radar a bit more and are harder to track down?
So do I understand your question correctly, that you wonder whether we have an overly criminal understanding of these individuals because some of the others are harder to track down? Well, in a way, I would argue that if you don't cause huge amount of hurt to other people or violate their rights, who cares? I mean, I don't really worry about somebody who is able to somehow mask their psychopathic traits by being kind and nice to other people. That person would not concern me. So I think, yes, I'm not saying that it's not possible that there isn't somebody who is just able to be very adaptive and appear very kind and nice. I think that, that is clearly a possibility. However, I would say that the reason that the research has focused on the individuals that are antisocial is that those are the people that violate the rights of other people, and therefore we care about understanding how that could be prevented. Ultimately, we probably don't care about somebody who is successful at masking those sorts of traits, because that's not a person that is a worry for them, for the other people around them.
Hi. How would you differentiate between a child who is predisposed to psychopathy and being a full-blown diagnosed as irreversible psychopathy in adulthood, I suppose?
The fact that they're a child. So you don't diagnose a child with an adult personality disorder, and we have clear data to show that these traits are not fixed. So therefore, you don't label a child a psychopath. So it's the fact that they're a child that you wouldn't call them a psychopath.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. As you've mentioned and as I've read, some have tried to push persons with psychopathy into the right direction by using their exaggerated self-interest to show them that they can get benefits from doing certain things. And I was wondering if you thought there were any alternatives or any better ways to push adults with psychopathy in the right direction.
Well, I think that's certainly something that there's already data as being something that works, but it clearly doesn't work for everyone. So we want to have more tools than just the appealing to self-interest. And as I mentioned, one of the things that we are interested in investigating is whether it's possible by, for instance, instrumental conditioning methods to try and generalize a positive effect to the social stimuli that most of us find rewarding and they don't, and whether that can then recalibrate some of the social interactions that these children have. But we need probably good 5-10 years of research before we can do that systematically and look at it. And I don't think that it's the only thing. Maybe some of them will benefit from some empathy induction if it happens early enough. I don't think it's going to get them to a kind of range where they're going to be great altruists, but it might be helpful, and it's an empirical question. So I think that a number of different tools are likely to be important, both for intervening with children and with the adults.
There's a question down here. You see with the white shirt? And then someone at the back in black. Not the person who's already had a question.
They can come and talk
Can
to
I
me
have the
afterwards.
white? Yes, go ahead.
Hello. I was going to ask, the percentage of people that don't turn into serial killers, right? And they just mold into society. How do they do that? Do they just get over it and just be like, oh yeah, I'm a psychopath, so I'm just going to live with it? How do they?
So only very, very small proportion of psychopaths are serial killers. So that's incredibly rare, even in individuals with psychopathy. So you're a very extreme case, and you probably have some other kind of additional problem, some sort of psychiatrists and psychologists call a paraphilia if you channel your psychopathic traits in that kind of way. So I don't think it's a case of these children are all in a path of becoming serial killers and then somehow, you manage to turn them away. I think actually very, very small percentage of them are.
Okay. So last question, please, at the back.
Hi. Sorry, you spoke about bullying, in particular with girls and spreading rumours.
Sorry, I have a bit of a difficulty hearing.
Have you got the microphone?
Sorry. Hi, sorry. You spoke about bullying, and particularly with regards to girls and probably more psychopathic traits within people who do reputational damage or that kind of thing in schools. I was just wondering what the research says about the percentage of that which is due to psychopathy, and then, I guess, more more environmental factors. I don't know.
So we've got a bullying expert in the audience, Luis Arsenault. As far as I know, there isn't any data that directly speaks to that. Am I right, Luis? Okay, so the bullying expert tells me that there's no data that directly speaks to that. I'm sorry.
Well, I think I should draw this to a close and thank Professor Viding for a fantastic lecture. You can just see how much people have been enthused and interested in it by the number of questions we have. I can see some of them are still here. So before I present her with the award, let's thank her once again. Now I have to find this. And now comes the best bit of the evening, when I present you, first of all, with the scroll. Congratulations very much on the Rosalind Franklin Award. You open the thing and show them the medal. Oh, no, not that one. This one. And now I have the pleasure to present you with the medal.
Thank you.
And of course, the cheque comes separately.
Good.
So, thank you very much again, Essi. But you may now go. That was completely fascinating.